Hello, Pickled Onion Knight here. Now, the Super Nintendo Classic is out today. Actually, technically it's not out today because I'm recording this in late August, but I intend it to go live on September the 29th, which is when the Super Nintendo Classic comes out. So, the Super Nintendo Classic is out today, and there's been rampant speculation all over the internet, pretty much ever since the console was announced, as to what Nintendo were going to do next with their classic consoles lineup. And there's been some suggestion that they may well choose to do an N64 Classic. Now, I would say I'm less optimistic that is ever going to happen, and so I decided to do this little video to try and outline my reasoning behind it, because although I do look upon these consoles with a certain air of nostalgia, I feel that perhaps I'm a little bit more grounded than some other people. And I like to look at things from a practical point of view rather than a, oh, I'd love that sort of point of view. So let me just start off. Nintendo sort of did already make a N64 Classic in a way. It was released by a company in China in 1998, I believe, and it was called the iQue. Now, this company still make other consoles. Well, they don't know, but they up until a couple of years ago, they still made Nintendo consoles, but they made Game Boy Advances and SPs. But the original iQue console was an N64, and it was basically it was like a cut down version of the hardware that was on the Nintendo 64 console. I don't have one, so I'm just going to show a picture up here. Basically how this worked is it was a sort of plug and play console, because at the time the rules in China were such that not only could you not have import consoles, but you couldn't have multi-game consoles officially. You still could buy them on the black market, but you weren't allowed to officially have multi-game consoles. They had to be plug and plays. The way Nintendo got round this was that they had one removable cartridge that came with a console, the idea being that you could buy other games, but it would overwrite the game that you already had on the cartridge, so would then technically still count as a plug and play because you couldn't buy the cartridges separately. So this is what they did, and basically it's a controller. It's not in the same shape as an N64 controller, it's its own shape. It doesn't have rumble features, it has one game at a time, and the rest are little demo games of stuff you can buy. I'll go into the games that were available for it in a little while. Multiplayer was available but did require an adapter and 3 separate controllers, which were just controllers that plugged into the original unit, which then plugged into the television. The controllers plugged into the adapter, which then plugged into the unit, which then plugged into the television. But it was effectively the Chinese N64 and was a plug and play. Now, it obviously didn't have the software built into the console. It was on this separate cartridge thing, like I said. So technically they already have made one, although for China at the time it was relatively expensive, costing, if you look at it in what most Chinese people earned at the time, it was actually far more expensive than a standard Nintendo 64. So a lot of people didn't bother buying the iQue, the official one. They just bought a black market Nintendo 64, which could be imported through Hong Kong much cheaper. Anyway, so when it comes to these modern plug and plays that Nintendo's doing, the NES Classic is a relatively easy, straightforward thing to do. Same with the Super Nintendo Classic, a relatively easy, straightforward thing to do. When it comes to the N64 though, the problem is always going to be that of price. Now, and this is basically how I'm going to break it down. Nintendo makes these things to make money. Nintendo doesn't care about your nostalgia. Okay? Now, this may be hard for some people to hear. Nintendo makes money from your nostalgia, but they don't care about it. They're not interested if you played Mario 3. They want you to play Super Mario 3D World. They don't care how much you like Mario 3, Mario World, Kirby, all the rest of it. They just want you to buy the new stuff. Nintendo is a company. They're not your friend. And they know that you wouldn't buy a plug and play over a certain price point. They spend millions on marketing managers and people like that and to work all this stuff out. So they have worked out that people will pay for a 2-player plug and play about $80 US. And the price is in US dollars because that's more international. So, yeah, you may say, oh, well, my NES Classic only cost me whatever it was in the US. I think it was $69.99? Well, yeah, okay, but then you had to pay extra to get the second controller on top, you know. So somewhere between 70 and 80 US dollars per argument. I'm going to go with the Super Nintendo Classic because that is 80 US dollars with 2 controllers, all the rest of it. So we're going to say that. Now, let's say that Nintendo makes a 20% profit on that $80. That is very high, but let's say that's what they make. So that leaves $60. Okay, so there's the $80 you've paid. There's the 20% profit that Nintendo have, and that's $60. That's the package you're left with. That's the console, the cables, 2 controllers. Now, that has to then include a retailer's cut. And that has to include distribution, because retailers generally don't... You know, retailers, the big retailers will buy directly from Nintendo, and then once it gets to their distribution centre, they will handle their own distribution. But Nintendo has to actually, you know, ship it to them and whatever from wherever it's made, usually in Germany. Certainly in Europe, it's all made in Germany. So Nintendo has to get it to its retailers. So that's distribution costs on either side all knocked out. They don't really have to worry about marketing because YouTube and the Gaming Press has pretty much done all their marketing for them. Nintendo doesn't really market these things. They just send out a press release to every every internet news agency, and it goes on from there. So they haven't spent an awful lot on the marketing budget. So when you start to factor all these things in, remember Nintendo's already taken its 20% profit, so they don't have to worry about that. The retailers aren't really marketing it either. You know, have you been in your local game store? Have you seen a poster up to pre-order your system? No, you haven't, because they don't exist, because they're not marketing them. So none of that is added onto the cost. So let's say we've thrown all that out and we've got somewhere between $30 and $35 left for what the actual console is, if you're following me. So we've taken out all the profits that everyone's made. We've taken out the distribution costs, all that sort of thing. We've taken out the marketing costs, which we didn't need to because there wasn't any. And now, say we've got a manufacturing cost of the box ready system, so the entire thing in its box of say $30 to $35 is left of the price you paid. So that means you have to get the system in the box, all the packaging, shrink wrapped, sellotaped, whatever, ready to go on a store shelf for about $35. Now remember, this is all the profits taken out. This is just the actual build cost for this system is what we have left, $35, give or take. And that is being generous. When it comes to the NES and SNES Classics, that is being generous. I imagine they're probably slightly higher margin than that. So let's see what we can buy with our $35 to run Nintendo 64 games. Now, you may be aware of another small computer board that's doing the rounds at the minute called Raspberry Pi. These come in 4 main iterations. You have at the bottom end the Pi Zero, which is a $5 board. You know, it's as basic as you can get. It's the chip, the memory, a video output, a sound output, you know, and a couple of USB ports. It is about as basic single board computer as you can get, and that is $5. The thing is, the Pi Zero can emulate it can emulate all NES games fine. It can emulate most Super Nintendo games fine. You know, it struggles a bit when you get towards the sort of Star Fox, Stunt Race FX, Street Fighter Alpha end of things, but most of the stuff it works pretty fine on. And that is a $5 board. Yeah, try getting a Nintendo 64 emulator to work on your Pi Zero. You know, just pause the video now. Go and get a Pi Zero. Get your Pi Zero out of the drawer. Try and get an N64 emulator to work on it. Well, exactly. There you go. So that's not going to work on your $5 Pi Zero. So the top line we've got is the Pi 3 B+, which is the beefiest Raspberry Pi you can get. At the moment, it goes for about $35. That's with no power supply, with no HDMI cable, no controllers, you know, anything else. So it is basically just the board. No shell, nothing. $35. And even then, the Pi 3 struggles with most N64 games. You'll probably get Mario 64 running fine. You'll probably get Turok 1 running fine. You'll get Cruising Route USA running fine. But if you want to play Conker, if you want to play Diddy Kong Racing, if you want to play Mario Kart, if you want to play Smash Brothers, if you want to play Donkey Kong, if you want to play, do you know what I mean? The list of games that won't even run on the Pi 3, unless you're a super duper whiz kid with code and can turn literally everything off while you're playing said emulator. You haven't got much chance of running most of the N64 library, even on the $35 price point of a Pi 3. And this is the problem. Now, Nintendo probably could come up with a way of running any N64 games that it would see fit to put on an out-of-the-box machine, like a plug-and-play console, but they wouldn't be able to do it for probably a lot less than at least $150. And nobody is going to spend $150 on an N64 plug and play. Some people will. The same people that bought NES classics on eBay, the people with money to burn, they well might. But the vast majority of people, I think, when you get above that $70 to $80 price point, maybe even inching $85, $90, I think once you get past that point, the vast majority of people just wouldn't be interested in buying it. So even when we get down, and this is even before we've spoken about controllers. So, and this is an issue. This is a particular issue for the Nintendo 64 because the controllers are complicated. They are reasonably expensive to produce, compared to NES or SNES Super Nintendo controllers. They are far more expensive to produce. So even if you take the Super Nintendo controller, I mean, what's it got? It's a thin circuit board in the controller, surrounded by plastic with a rubber membrane on top and 11 separate buttons. You know, NES controllers, obviously less buttons. You know, when you then come to the N64 controller, suddenly you're adding a pressure-sensitive Z trigger. You're adding an analog stick. And then you have to think, well, hang on a minute, there's that slot on the bottom of the controller as well. So do we add that? And then if we do we make it compatible with, say, the Rumble Pack? Okay, so then do we have to release a separate Rumble Pack that people can buy? Because not everyone's going to have the old one. Or do we do away with, do we add Rumble as a feature in the new controller? as standard. You don't need a separate rumble pack. In which case, do we keep the slot? Well, we have to keep the slot because then it looks like the old N64 controller. So what do we use that slot for? Do we make it compatible with, say, the Game Boy Pokemon adapter? Or do we just remove that feature altogether? Or, you know, is there some other way to do it? So how much are these controllers then suddenly going to cost to produce? Not just the system. So remember, we've got, what, $35 left. And we've got to produce a system that runs the N64 games we want to put on it. We've also got to produce a controller, at least one. Now, do we bundle it with 2 controllers? Because that's even more cost. Or do we add 4-player functionality? Because it was a 4-player console originally. Do we add 4 controller ports? Okay, that's more expense. So do we bundle it with 4 controllers, or do we make them available separately? And if we make them available separately, how many do we have to build to make sure that the people that buy the 1 or 2-player version are actually going to buy any separate controllers? And are people going to buy 4 controllers? You know, are you going to buy the console with a controller plus 3 other controllers? You know, and this must be, if Nintendo is considering this idea, this will be exactly the conversation they're having with themselves. You know, so basically, just the outline cost of them doing this is gonna, they're not going to be able to sell this thing at $80 or $90, even $90. I reckon you're going to see more into $150, $160 before they would even consider releasing this onto the market. And then even so, probably more for separate controllers if it did happen. And then, so how much are you actually talking for, say, a 4-player Nintendo 64 system? Plug and play. You know, I mean, there's not, even, as I've said, even a Raspberry Pi 3 or something like that can't do all the games reliably. So, are you then designing your own hardware? And as far as I know, there's no system on a chip for the Nintendo 64. There is for the NES and there is for the Super Nintendo. There is no system on a chip for the Nintendo 64. There's no FPGAs or anything like that for the Nintendo 64. So you would have to do it through emulation. Or Nintendo could design their own system on a chip, but then they're spending money on R&D. So how are they actually going to do this? I don't see it happening. And that's just the hardware. So let's say that Nintendo does release this thing, and they are making a profit, and it does end up costing, you know, $160, say, $150, $160, say. And it comes with 2 controllers. But if you want to play 4-player, you've got to buy 2 other controllers. They're $20 each. So now you're talking $200 to get a 4-player Nintendo 64 that plugs into your TV through the HDMI and runs on a USB. I don't know about that. But even if you are still the sort of person that would go, well, I'd probably pay it. Have a think. And actually think about what games would be able to be on there that you would actually want to play. Right, now just sit back and think about it, because I've sat back and thought about it. And I'm going to now explain to you why suddenly a $200 Nintendo 64 plug and play isn't going to be a good idea anyway, based on the games that Nintendo would actually be able to put on it. So I'm going to move over to the other side of the room where I've got a little blackboard, and I am going to go through all the games that would be able to be on there. Now, bearing in mind, I'm going to be talking about how many, I'm going to be talking about what games they are, and I'm also going to be talking briefly about licensing, because, like I said, Nintendo's in it to make money. Every game they have to license from somebody else means that their profits are going down. So even if it's by pennies a unit, their profits are still going down every unit sold because they have to pay a license to somebody else if they want to use a licensed property. And depending on who that company is, that might cost them nothing, it might cost them a lot. So this is part of the issue with the games on the Nintendo 64. I know Nintendo received a lot of flack at the time because basically the N64 had very little third-party support. That's true if you're talking about publishing studios. But it had an awful lot of licensed properties in the games. And some of the licensed stuff that belongs to other companies are some of the better games on the system. And that is unfortunate. So I'm just going to explain, if it did happen, and if they did manage to sort out the hardware, and if they did manage to make it for a price point that would be reasonable, what you might actually expect to see on a plug-and-play Nintendo 64. Right, so let's start with the games. Now, this is a list I've drawn up because this is the games that were available as I've mentioned before, the iQue that was released in China in the late 90s. And I'm very confident that if Nintendo was able to license these games out to a Chinese company for its legitimately produced Chinese console with pretty much no hassle whatsoever, I can be very confident that Nintendo has the controlling rights on all of these games. So this is a good basic list of, if you were to get a plug-and-play Nintendo 64, you could be guaranteed that all of these would be on them. So we've got Animal Crossing, Custom Robo, Mario 64, Dr. Mario 64, F-Zero X, Excitebike 64, Mario Kart 64, Paper Mario, Sin and Punishment, Smash Brothers, Star Fox 64, called Lilac Wars in Europe, but it was called Star Fox 64 on the iQue, so that's what we're going to call it, Wave Race 64, and Zelda Ocarina of Time. Not Majora's Mask, that did not come out for the iQue. It was planned, but it did not come out. So let's say that this is a definite list of stuff that would appear on the console if it existed, with no real problems. Cheap for Nintendo to do because they own the rights to all these games, and so no licensing, anything like that. They can just take them out of storage and put them straight on the console. The trouble comes when you have what I've decided to term as a wish list of Nintendo games. Games that I would like to see on a on a plug-and-play Nintendo 64. And I'm going to start writing them on the board here underneath my wish list of games, and then I'm going to cut away and I'm going to explain to you why the vast majority of them wouldn't appear on a plug-and-play Nintendo 64 if it were released now. Right now, I've very quickly scribbled a wish list all over the board here. So this is the games that we're sure are going to be on there because they were on the Chinese version, and that means that Nintendo probably has controlling interest in all of these games and properties. So some of the old favourites, and I've started running out of space, so I've been a bit quick with some of them. So Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, whichever one of the two is your favourite. Now owned by Microsoft. So even if Nintendo could get the license for them, how much do you think they'd have to pay for it? I'm guessing more than it would be worth. So we'll just get rid of Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie. Bomberman 64, now that's HAL Laboratories, so they should be fine with that. So we'll keep Bomberman 64 there. So Bomberman 64 is one that's staying. Conker's Bad Fur Day. Conker's Bad Fur Day. Again, owned by Microsoft. Do you seriously see Nintendo getting the license for that game? And even if they did, they're more kid-friendly than ever these days. Probably wouldn't see the light of day on a Nintendo console these days. Although, you know, they did do. I can't remember what the fuck it's called. I own the bloody game as well. Project Zero or Fatal Frame, if you prefer. So you never know. But even then, Microsoft owns that, and do you seriously giving them Nintendo the license to produce it? I don't either. No. So we'll get rid of that. DK64. Now, this is a funny one. Because although Microsoft bought the Rare games, Donkey Kong was actually a Nintendo property. So likelihood is, if they were to release Nintendo 64, it would have Donkey Kong 64 on it. So we'll keep that. Because although technically the game engine is owned by Microsoft, or Rare as was, and then became Microsoft, Donkey Kong 64 Donkey Kong is a Nintendo property, therefore owned by Nintendo, therefore, you know, Microsoft can't do anything with it anyway, so they may as well let them have that. GoldenEye, based on the James Bond movies. So, no, the amount of money you'd have to pay the Broccoli Foundation these days in order to get a James Bond anything done, unlikely. So, one of the best multiplayer games on the system, you're not going to see it on there. This one might just be appealing. This one might just be appealing to the Brits or the Europeans. International Superstar Soccer. Probably the best football game on the system, and you have to have a couple of sports games, so why not? It's a Konami game, wouldn't cost Nintendo much for the license, so we can count that one as in. Killer Instinct, again, I'm pretty sure that's owned by Microsoft as well now, and they're not going to let that go for cheap, and Nintendo won't pay to license that. So, bad luck there. Kirby, you'll definitely see Kirby, there's no questions of that, even though I'm pretty sure that's HAL Laboratories as well. They are still owned by Nintendo, or at least majority owned by Nintendo, so you will see Kirby on it. Mario Party again, there are 3 of them, so they've got 1, 2 or 3 to pick for. I'd probably go 2, but you will see a Mario Party game on there. Mario Tennis, again, you will see that on there because they've only got 1 other sports game so far that I can think of that's any good. Mortal Kombat 4. No, you're not going to see that on there. And I'll tell you for why. Number 1, because it's not very good. Number 2, because nobody played it. And number 3, because, again, I'm not certain whether Nintendo, especially with the plug and plays, would probably go a bit kid friendly with it. You know, you never know. They have surprised me in the past, but I just don't see Mortal Kombat 4 on a Nintendo produced plug and play. I'm sorry, but I don't. Perfect Dark, no clue. I don't know who owns Perfect Dark. Honestly, I couldn't find out. I think it was Rare originally, but I don't know if Microsoft got that one or that was sold on separately. I couldn't find out any information on it, so we'll just put a big question mark by Perfect Dark. It depends who owns it and how much they'd have to pay for the license. I'll tell you for sure, Nintendo doesn't own it, so they would have to license that game out. The 3 Pokemon games. Now again, this goes back to the thing with the controller. Do you make them compatible with the Game Boy games? And if so, how do you make them compatible with the Game Boy games? Do you make the controller compatible with the old adapter? Do you produce a new type of adapter that works with the old cartridges? Or do you just forget it and take that whole compatibility thing out of the game? But no doubt you will probably see at least 1 Pokemon game on the system. But then, what is Pokemon Snap going to be like if you can't go and print your stickers out? So, I don't know. You might see a Pokemon game on there. You might not. Again, big question mark. Well, not writing this very well because I'm not left-handed. I'm writing with my left hand, but I'm actually right-handed. So, Turok, again, reasonably playable shooty games. You know, how many of them are you going to see on the system, if any at all? Who owns them? Again, couldn't find out. So, yeah. I mean, anyone's guess is as good as mine. But they weren't very popular. Nobody talks about Turok. No, I mean, when was the last time you heard somebody mention the N64 and mention playing Turok? So I don't know whether it would be popular enough to actually put on a plug-and-play system. But we'll put another question mark by that. The WWF games, now they are fun. They are fun on the N64. All four of them are varying degrees of fun, but they're all playable, and, you know, multiplayer and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, they're WWF. So no. How much, you know, however much you thought you might have to pay Vince for a license in the 90s, you can add a couple of zeros to that now, before he'll let you make a game. Or he just produces his own. But on a plug and play, no chance. Racing games. Whichever your favourite racing game is on the system, it's probably one of the 100 racing games that came out for the system. That's why I've put an X100. The trouble is, a lot of them were licensed properties. Or they had licensed properties contained within the game. For instance, Beetle Racing. Yeah, you're probably not going to have to pay much to Volkswagen or whoever, you know, to release the game with regards to the properties contained within the game. But who made it? I mean, you know, who knows? A lot of these companies that made the racing games on the system, maybe the one that you liked as a child, a lot of these companies don't exist anymore. And who's to say whether the companies that hold the licenses are going to grant them to Nintendo, or whether Nintendo is even going to go bothering looking for them? The only one I can think of, the only racing game that isn't a kart game, obviously, so you could have Diddy Kong Racing, most likely. Although, actually, no, you couldn't, because that contains characters in it that are owned by Rare and therefore Microsoft. So you couldn't have Diddy Kong Racing. The only reason you can have Donkey Kong is because every character in it is a Nintendo character. You can't have Diddy Kong Racing because plenty of characters in it aren't. So you'd have to drastically change the game in order to release it, and are Nintendo going to pay to do that themselves? Of course they're not. But the only racing game I could think of that isn't Mario Kart that Nintendo could put out is Cruising USA, and that's because that is their own property. Cruising USA is a Nintendo game. It was Nintendo funded, and they own the rights to that. So basically we take this 100 odd racing games and we turn it into Cruising USA. So there we are. So I'll sort of half scrub out the ones that I've put question marks by. So now we've got how many definite games? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. We've got 20 games that we can be pretty sure would be on the system. Now, you tell me, given everything that I've said so far in this video, even if you got 3 Pokemon games, Perfect Dark and Turok as well, because these have got question marks next to them, would you pay perhaps $200 for a plug and play that had this set of games on it? Would you? Because I don't think I would. This is the trouble, and this is another reason why I just don't see it happening. And that's it. I think I've pretty much summed up where my thoughts are on this system. Right, okay, hang on. Just had a thought. Plus Majora's Mask. So we're talking 21 now. And then, even then, maybe something you could throw on there that was unreleased from the 64 disk drive. So maybe if we add in Doshin the Giant. Right. So are we... I don't know. Hang on. that'll do. You know what I mean? Doshin the Giant, something like that. So even if we're now talking these 21 games, including one that was never released on the system, although it was planned for the system, albeit an add-on to it, are we still talking $200 worth of value here? I'm not sure. I couldn't justify $200 for that selection. Now, like I say, and I'm going to say it again in a minute, I'll say it now, if you can think of anything else that possibly would be easy enough and worth Nintendo putting on one of these plug-and-play systems, then I'd be happy to hear your comments. But this is a list that I spent about an hour and a half working on, you know, because I've got it written down. I haven't just pulled this out of my arse. And I can't see a $200-odd value there. You know, I just don't see it. So I'm going to go back over there and sit down and sum this all up. So after looking at all that, I think I've very safely burst your bubble, everyone else in the world. And I'm sorry to do that, but it has to be said, if you're saving up thinking that you're going to be first in line when the pre-orders go live for the N64 Mini, I would spend your money on something else, because I don't think it's likely to happen next year or any other time ever. You know, 5 years time maybe. You know, ARM processors and things might get to the point where they're still very, very low powered, but powerful enough, you know, speed wise or whatever else it needs, in order to run reliable N64 games. But until that point, it's not happening. Until the point where you can reliably run Nintendo 64 games on your $30 Raspberry Pi, you're not going to see a plug and play N64. It's just not going to happen. So you're just going to have to grin and bear it with your Switches and buy stuff on the Nintendo Online Store when it actually starts doing stuff properly. Yeah. I know it's sad, but that's just what I think. And I may be wrong. I hope I am wrong, but I don't think I am. So yeah, as usual, there's a, you know, this is one that I am looking for feedback. If you think I've missed anything, if you think I've been unfair, provably so, and if you can put it in a nice way, you're very welcome to use the comments section on the bottom of the videos. There's a Twitter thing here as well you can use if you really, really need to. Yeah, I'll put a little subscribe thing here, and there's a couple of more videos that have appeared on the side here that you might like to watch. And I've been the Pickled Onion Knight, and I've hate to kill your dreams, but you know, that's the way it is, and I'll see you in another video.